One of the most natural and most enjoyable topics of conversation when it comes to From Software Soulsborne games is favorite bosses. If you ask me, From Software's boss battles are simply best in class. So much so that they've become the measuring sticks for all boss battles in video games today. To be honest, boss battles are the aspect of Elden Ring that I'm most anticipating. I suppose I've had bosses on the mind lately because I can't stop imagining all the new and amazing encounters we're likely in store for come January 2022. Now, conversations about boss battles can go a couple different ways. There's the debate over the best all-around bosses, and then there's the debate over the hardest to beat bosses. And I'm not wading into those waters today because I know that different players have different sensibilities, different players struggle more or less with different bosses, etc. In this video, I'm strictly discussing my personal favorite bosses, the battles I enjoy most, the bosses that I think have the coolest movesets, the coolest designs, the coolest arenas, the coolest music, and on and on. So based on those subjective criteria, I'm going to share my top 10 bosses, ranked in order from 10 to 1, 1 being my very favorite. And look, this list, even though it's based on my personal preferences, was still really hard to devise because there's just so many bosses from each of the 6 games, from Demon Souls to Sekiro, that I wanted to include. But I tried to be very judicious and honestly narrow down a top 10 that at least represents my tastes at this point in time. Now, one last caveat, because this is YouTube and it's often necessary to throw up an extra road sign or two like this. I'm not saying these are the best From Software bosses. I'm saying these are my personal favorites. And my personal favorites may be very different than your personal favorites. And that's totally fine. In fact, that's preferred. It's interesting to discuss why we like certain bosses more than others, why certain battles resonate with us most. So certainly feel free to go down into the comments and share your personal top 10 list with me and let me know if there's any overlap between our personal lists. I always enjoy hearing from you all about your experiences with these games. But without further delay, here we go. Here are my top 10 From Software bosses. Number 10, the Guardian Ape from Sekiro. The appeal of the Guardian Ape is self-evident. This is simply a classic Miyazaki boss, an unexpected twist in a game in which we are so often locking swords with another human, bosses that are roughly the same size as our player character, Wolf. Yet the ape is large and intimidating. His wild animations and angry howls are terrifying. Yet, in classic Miyazaki fashion, there's also a comedic element to this boss. I mean, he literally throws feces and poisonous farts at you. And like with Lady Butterfly, just when you think you've killed him, and for good reason, you cut off his head as the words "Shinobi Execution" flash on the screen, you're taken aback as Sekiro veers into supernatural territory and the ape rises from the dead, seemingly possessed by a parasite inside of him, initiating the battle's unique second phase. I actually feel the Guardian Ape is one of the relatively easier bosses in Sekiro, but that in no way affects my enjoyment of the battle itself. It's always fun and it's always exciting. And yes, later in the game, the Headless Ape boss battle in Ashina Depths is technically harder because you're fighting not one, but 2 apes in a relatively tight cave. But I prefer the straightforwardness of the first encounter in the Sunken Valley. Such an iconic boss, one that I knew I loved within the initial moments of our first face-off. The Guardian Ape's gotta be on my top 10 list, no question. Number 9, Ornstein and Smo from Dark Souls 1. What can I say about ONS that hasn't already been said? 10 years later, these guys are easily in the Video Game Boss Battle Hall of Fame. And no matter what kind of player you are, even a speedrunner or combat specialist, at one time we were all green and timid, playing Dark Souls for the very first time. And this battle surprised and tested us all. It also established the very cool Soulsborne convention of gatekeeping mid-game bosses like Genichiro and Pontiff Sullivan. Bosses that can feel almost impossible or unreasonable at first, but beyond their challenge is a teaching moment, an opportunity to better learn the game's systems and develop the necessary confidence for tackling anything that the late game throws at us. ONS were the very first bosses to truly shock we Soulsborne players mid-battle, not unlike the Guardian Ape's unexpected second phase which we just discussed. If you strike down Smo first, Ornstein seemingly mourns his fallen comrade before violently siphoning what's left of Smo's life force to become an even larger, more powerful version of himself, and vice versa if you first strike down Ornstein. These variations within the boss battle, the fact that FromSoft is throwing two independently strong boss AIs at us at once is what makes this fight so unforgettable. And while admittedly the AI advancements in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 and Sekiro have made many of the boss battles in Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 feel relatively antiquated by comparison, I think ONS have aged really well. These guys still put up an aggressive fight in 2021, no matter your skill level. Their thrilling music, their cathedral arena, their weapon and armor design, ONS embody all the qualities of classic video game bosses, and that's why they're number 9 on my list. Number 8, the Demon of Hatred from Sekiro. Like I said previously about the Guardian Ape, we're so used to fighting blade-wielding human bosses in Sekiro that when I entered the burning Ashina Castle Gate Fortress for the second time during my playthrough, which, by the way, isn't the symbolic use of fire in Sekiro so well done, but when I walked into this familiar arena and saw Manus 2.0 waiting for me, I couldn't believe it. Not to mention the lore implications here with the sculptor, that this boss represents someone you know, someone who's helped you along your journey, now transformed into a seething Oni or monster. And the music. This is one of Yuka Kitamura's craziest compositions from the masterful Sekiro soundtrack. It puts you on edge. Its instruments and chaotic melody convey the demon's anger and madness. Man, and what a sick design. For me, the demon is one of the best ever boss designs we've seen from Miyazaki and his team. Seeing something that looks like it crawled straight out of Bloodborne and is now running amok in 16th century Japan, it's so nuts. That's why it's number 8 on my list. Number 7, the Twin Princes from Dark Souls 3. The Twin Princes to me represent Dark Souls at its best. Two bosses, each creepy and intriguing in their own way. The elder, a mute and crippled brute, wielding a flaming stained black greatsword, and the younger and inconspicuous caster, whose magic homing projectiles can deliver a swift death. Yet, both of these royal brothers, though they may appear to the Ashen One as little more than foes, are actually somewhat tragic, even admirable figures in my estimation. Lorien was once a heroic knight who single-handedly defeated the Demon Prince, and Lothric, with whom the kingdom featured in Dark Souls 3 shares its name, was destined to become a great champion to link the First Flame and become a Lord of Cinder. However, Lothric was uninterested in this mantle and its rituals, and instead rejected his duty and resolved to watch the fire fade. A familial curse plagued Lothric, who was small and frail, but the elder knight Lorien chose to share in his little brother's curse, leaving him unable to talk or walk. Together, we find these brothers at the very top of Lothric Castle, awaiting the end of the world and the end of the legacy of lords, for it to, quote, all fade into nothing, end quote, in the words of the younger prince. I remember during my first playthrough of DS3, I thought Lothric seemed arrogant and accusatory, but on repeated playthroughs, I began to understand the philosophy that guided his thinking. It's the same philosophy that leads to my favorite ending of DS3, the End of Fire, which connects so beautifully with the continued story of the game's 2 DLCs. Now, when I face these bosses, I often feel confused or even guilty about cutting them down, even if I'm rushing through and speedrunning, because, well, I can relate to their motivation. But gosh, this battle, it's so special. It was so creative of Miyazaki and his team to design a showdown with a crippled swordsman. Lorien's audible groans and pained animations tell such a story about his character, yet he remains ferocious. His teleporting mechanic is one of my favorites of any Soulsborne boss, and in my first playthrough when Lothric crawled onto his older brother's back and began casting at me during the battle's second phase, it was such a surprise. I actually remember getting wrecked by these guys quite a few times in that first playthrough before I learned the rhythm of this battle. Lorien's teleporting, the swings of his sword, Lothric's casting patterns, his ability to resurrect his older brother, etc. Like I said, this battle represents Dark Souls at its best, and that's why it's on my list. Number 6, the Nameless King from DS3. His name says it all. This boss is so sick, he doesn't even have one. In all seriousness, this Stormdrake riding god of war is likely the firstborn child of Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and the memorable final boss in the base game of DS1. There's such a deep and interesting lore rabbit hole when it comes to this boss, but I want to primarily talk about his role in DS3 and the battle itself, which you could argue is the toughest in the base game. The epic music, the stormy environment, the way in which the king swoops in on his Stormdrake. The intimidation factor in this battle is extremely high. There's a lot to learn across this battle's two phases. To me, it feels like this boss was intended to test the core fans. He's at the very end of an optional, borderline trolly area of the game. When DS3 first came out, before the many wikis and video walkthroughs, Archdragon Peak was not easy to find. And to this day, the battle holds up really well. There's the beautiful parallel too with this battle and ONS, the way in which the king puts his mount out of its misery while strengthening himself for the second phase. If someone had never seen or heard of Soulsborne, you could show them this battle and this battle alone and they'd get the gist, I'm sure. Number 5, Champion Gundyr from DS3. Champion Gundyr is one of the most aggressive bosses in all of Soulsborne, and that's precisely why he's one of my very, very favorites. We first meet Gundyr as Udex Gundyr, DS3's tutorial boss. Here, he is an arbiter, forever destined to test the mettle of unkindled who wish to link the flame, because in his time, Gundyr also sought to link the flame, but arrived too late. According to the soul of Champion Gundyr, quote, "He was greeted by a shrine without fire and a bell that would not toll," end quote. In the darkness of untended graves, we, the Ashen One, find Champion Gundyr during this moment, at the peak of his powers, but on the cusp of his own failure. You can sense the gravity. Gundyr is angry. He wants to destroy you, an unknown trespasser from another time, and his temperament ensures that this fight won't last long. He'll swiftly kick and cut you down, or he'll die trying. Regardless, there is a beautiful dance to be experienced here. If you can learn Gundyr's patterns, you can learn to win this incredible fight with a careful combination of offense and defense. Throwing the player into a rematch with a significantly stronger version of the game's tutorial boss with lore this good is one of DS3's many strokes of genius. I love Gundyr's armor, his cast iron halberd, his moveset, his speed, the dark, candlelit arena. Everything about this battle speaks to me. Plus, while it's an optional boss battle, it's required for completing the End of Fire ending, my personal favorite ending in DS3. Number 4, Father Gascoigne from Bloodborne. Father Gascoigne is very high on this list for me. I'm not saying he's the best or hardest boss in Bloodborne, but he is my personal favorite. In my mind, he's the poster boy for tragically corrupted Soulsborne bosses. Gascoigne was once a hunter, just like our player character. Item descriptions suggest he may have been a cleric in a foreign land before coming to Yharnam, where he had a daughter and a wife named Viola. But over time, he succumbed to blood drunkenness and became more monster than man. He became the very kind of frenzied beast that he himself had hunted countless times. On the night of the hunt, Viola is missing, last known to be out searching the city streets for her husband, and their daughter, if visited at her home, gives us a tiny music box, a sentimental family trinket, and asks us to find her mother. Eventually, we find Viola's body in the tomb of Odin. But before then, we find Gascoigne in a cemetery just outside the tomb, with its key in his possession. In the dark, surrounded by headstones and barren trees, he's mindlessly mutilating corpses. And as we approach, he mutters, quote, "Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later," end quote. I always wondered if he was talking to himself more than he was talking to us. Gascoigne then turns and snarls in a scene that feels like it was torn straight out of a black and white 20th century horror film, and so begins the first mandatory boss battle in Bloodborne. And boy, to this day, it's a thrill, especially coming after Dark Souls 2, which is a much slower game. If we go back to Dark Souls 1, it's Artorias of the Abyss DLC. That's the last piece of Dark Souls content that Miyazaki directed before he began exclusively working on Bloodborne. And its Artorias and Manus boss battles are so much faster than most base game bosses. They're great battles, but you can feel it. They're almost too fast for the game's infrastructure. By the time of this DLC, Miyazaki was clearly in a different place creatively. From a combat standpoint, he was even more so interested in speed and fast-paced action that required precise, split-second inputs from the player. So I always liked that you can kind of draw a line straight from Artorias and Manus to Gascoigne, and boy, what a leap it is. As of 2015, we Soulsborne fans were used to primarily fighting large bosses like the Tower Knight and Seath the Scaleless and the Last Giant. But here's a boss who at first glance appears much like us, a hunter with a firearm and a transforming axe. Now, I love Orphan of Kos, Lady Maria, Ludwig, and so on, but there's just something about Gascoigne. He's so classic, and statistically speaking, he's basically the biggest gatekeeper in the history of Soulsborne. Only 45% of players have defeated him, according to the PlayStation Network, so that really tells you something. Many players who make up the unsuccessful 55% might not know that you can actually use the music box to somewhat cheese Gascoigne, but regardless, it's a great battle. And gosh, the work by voice actor Connor Byrne. He only has a few lines of dialogue, but gosh, he kills it. And despite those limitations, his performance does so much to bring this tragic character to life. And the soundtrack, Gascoigne's theme is The Hunter by Ryan Amen, my single favorite piece in the game. These are all reasons why Gascoigne is number 4 on my list. I never tire of this showdown, Hunter versus Hunter in the dark and foggy cemetery. Number 3, the Dancer of the Boreal Valley from DS3. The Dancer's design is as awesome as any boss in all of Soulsborne. Her hunched posture, lanky stature, enchanted swords, and slithery snake-like movements make for one of the most memorable boss battles I've ever experienced in a video game. Her items and item descriptions suggest she could possibly be one of Guinevere's daughters, who was captured and corrupted by Pontiff Sulyvahn, likely the biggest villain in all of DS3. Sulyvahn first ordered her to serve as a dancer, which is how she got her nickname, and then later he made her an outrider knight, and her dramatic, spider-like entrance hints that she might have a connection to the Abyss itself, much like Artorias did, which is a boss character that the dancer somewhat reminds me of. She and Vort stand guard on the high wall of Lothric, and the dancer specifically blocks our access to Lothric Castle itself. Her dark, claustrophobic arena, her soundtrack, another banger by Yuka Kitamura, truly one of Kitamura's most spellbinding compositions. And From Software's sound design here, the dancer's echoing footsteps, deceptively plodding across the stone floor. The fight is equal parts terrifying and awe-inspiring. and the dancer's movements are as fluid as her name suggests. I was reminded on a recent speedrun of DS3 that this is a challenging fight. The dancer's movements, as graceful as they are, almost feel awkward or offbeat. She's unpredictable, yet has some long windups and long executions that really test the player character's endurance. If there are any showdowns this good in Elden Ring, we're in for a real treat. Number 2, Ishin the Sword Saint from Sekiro. Ishin, the aging warrior of legend, is a mysterious, almost omnipresent figure throughout Sekiro. He's actually the one who gives our player character the nickname Sekiro, which translates to one-armed wolf. And at the end of the game, well, depending on which ending you choose, my personal favorite is the tear-jerking purification ending, which follows this boss battle. But at the end of the game, after Wolf defeats Genichiro for the last time in the iconic Silvergrass field, Genichiro uses the Black Mortal Blade to cast a dying wish and summon a younger and prime version of his grandfather from the beyond. This leads to a final showdown between Wolf and Ishin that feels like a scene straight out of a Kurosawa film. To say the least, Ishin the Sword Saint was very intimidating when I first faced him. Not only did I have to dispatch Genichiro again, but Ishin had 3 phases, a dynamic moveset, high damage output. It definitely felt like the game's final exam. But as I gradually mastered Sekiro's combat system, this battle not only became increasingly manageable, but it also became fun. By the time I could no-hit Ishin, this encounter felt less like a fight and more like a dance. For me, Ishin is one of the best and most satisfying boss battles ever designed by From Software. I think you could argue that Al the Father, the Demon of Hatred, and possibly even the Emma/Ishin Ashina boss battles are tougher. But for me, Sword Saint is far and away the best boss battle in the entire game. His sweeping moveset and attack animations are beautiful to behold. There's a real gracefulness to this battle, and he's also standing on the shoulders of the great late-game bosses that came before him. Gwen, Gehrman, Orphan of Kos, Slave Knight Gale, etc. Even though he was wrecking me in our first ever encounter, when he pulled out his firearm in Phase 2 and began unloading on me Bloodborne style, oh man, I got goosebumps. I love Sword Saint, and he's so close to being number 1 for me, but he loses out by just a hair to none other than my number 1 favorite From Software Soulsborne boss, Slave Knight Gale from DS3. The Dark Souls trilogy ends with what is, in my opinion, the best boss battle in any From Software game to date. The combination of this arena and Ashen Dune field at the end of the world, with Gale's AI, animations, and lore implications, creates a boss encounter that for me is second to none. On the surface, I love that this fight seemingly depicts 2 nobodies in the middle of nowhere fighting over some fading relic of yore, the Dark Soul. However, Souls fans know that this moment is so special precisely because of its deeper significance. To put it simply, Gale isn't inherently evil. In fact, he's been trying to help the painting woman inside the painted world of Ariandel. She wants to create a new painting that is safe and free of corruption, quote, a cold, dark, and very gentle place, end quote. But she lacks the necessary materials. By the way, it is ironic that the painted worlds are intended to be sanctuaries of the forlorn, but inevitably rot over time. For her new canvas, the painting woman requires everlasting pigment, a material that will never rot. So her so-called Uncle Gale, a slave knight from an ancient age, sets out after the blood of the legendary Dark Soul. He finds it too after a long search in the possession of the Pygmy Lords at the very end of the world. He consumes them and the Dark Soul itself, but too many ages have passed. The soul is old and its blood is dry as a bone. This is when we find Gale in a slump, hostile, bloodthirsty, and totally corrupted. Partway through the battle, an epiphany strikes when Gale begins bleeding. Because he consumed the Dark Soul, this fresh blood would surely serve as the pigment the painting woman needs. So, tragically, we must finish the job and strike Gale down for good. But it isn't easy. The Dark Soul has transformed him into an agile and ferocious monster with 3 phases and a boatload of HP, who tests our skills unlike any boss before him. My only wish, because Gale is the final boss of the final DLC and the final game of the trilogy, is that he was even harder. But that's a small gripe, and that kind of challenge is precisely what the New Game Plus cycle is for. For me, this battle has it all. A fast pace, 3 phases, awesome design, excellent animations, beautiful art direction. It's the total package, and it's my measuring stick for boss battles in all non-From Software games and all future From Software games. And in my opinion, the story at the end of the Ringed City with Gale and the Painting Woman, and the showdown over the Dark Soul itself at the end of the world, it's the best lore that Miyazaki and the FromSoft team have ever created. So that's it. Those are my top 10 From Software bosses. In the end, my list includes 5 bosses from DS3, 3 bosses from Sekiro, 1 boss from Bloodborne, and 1 boss from DS1. It was so hard to omit so many of my honorable mentions. Those include Flamelurker, King Allant, Artorias, Fume Knight, Burnt Ivory King, Ludwig, Lady Maria, Orphan of Kos, Pontiff Sullivan, Dragon Slayer Armor, Soul of Cinder, and there's so many more. But what about you? What are your top 10 Soulsborne bosses? There's no right or wrong list, just head down to the comments and tell me which boss battles resonate with you most. I wanted to do this list now, pre-Elden Ring, because who knows what my new list will look like down the road. I hope very different than it does now. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and remember that you can find me on Twitter at terapop_tweets, on Instagram at terapopgram, on Discord at Terapop's Treehouse, and on Patreon at patreon.com/terapop, where I offer all kinds of cool tiers and perks for my patrons. Of course, only contribute if you're able to do so, but this is a great way to support what I do and to ensure more future content like this video right here. Before I sign off, I also must give a huge and hearty shout out to my friend and the amazingly talented artist Jorge Perez, who graciously allowed me to showcase his 2018 painting of Slave Knight Gale in my video thumbnail. Jorge has created some of the very best Soulsborne fan art that I have ever seen, and I don't say that lightly. You'd swear he worked for From Software. His work is seriously that good, so definitely go check out Jorge on Instagram, YouTube, ArtStation, and Redbubble, where you can actually buy his stuff. So thank you again, Jorge. It's sincerely a privilege to have your work associated with my channel in any way, shape, or form. And for all those web pages I mentioned, the links you need are down in the description. So that's all for now. Thanks again. I look forward to hearing about your favorite bosses, and I'll catch you next time.